Okay, here we are. We're going to start this study, Eternity Past through Eternity Future, and we're reading the chronological version of the NLT Bible, and we're going to try to go through what we read one. So this is the chart that my uncle gave me, Uncle Guy, and it takes us from eternity past to eternity future. Actually, we're going to do about a third of the chart the first week of the reading. So that's the whirlwind. I think the most important thing to me about this past future idea is that there is a plan to redeem mankind and to redeem planet Earth. So we looked at dispensations as divisions for the Bible, and we looked at something called stages that was presented by a gentleman from Liberty University, Dr. Wilmington. And his first stage of creation is divided into three dispensations: the dispensation of innocence, conscience, and civil government, or sometimes it's just called government or human government. It can be given all those names. Then the dispensation of promise is called by Dr. Wilmington the patriarchal stage, or the patriarchs, the fathers of the clans or the tribes, starting with Abraham. And then the law, the dispensation of law, is very long. It goes from Moses all the way through to the end of the Old Testament. And then we have the dispensation of grace, which is the church age, the age we're living in now. And Dr. Wilmington breaks that into the gospel stage, the early church age, and the epistle age. And finally, the book of Revelation is really the final stage, the epistles for Wilmington, but it's divided into the millennial kingdom and the new heaven and the new earth. And I think that's fun when we get there. And every time we do this, or at least what I do, I keep going back to that umbrella, to the overview, to see where I am in the study. So if you just look at what we read this week and you look at that big chart, I tried to highlight, and I think you can see that shaded out area.
Right.
That's what we read. I mean, we read all the way from creation through this Adam and Eve, and dispensation of innocence, and then conscience, which is Adam to Noah, human government, which was the Tower of Babel era. And then we started in on the promise. And I don't think we're going to get that far today, but we'll do as much as we can. So, Genesis. We read through chapter 24 of Genesis, and the study in the NLT Chronological Bible took us into Chronicles, which was interesting because it's just the part of Chronicles that were the genealogies, the begats. And I thought that was fun that they stuck that in there. But so if you overview what we're supposed to cover in week one, Genesis 1 and 2 talked about creation. Genesis 3 was the fall. Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Genesis 5 was the genealogy of up to Noah. Genesis 6 through 9 covered the flood. 10 and 11, the Tower of Babel. And then 12 starts the patriarchal era for both the stages and the dispensations. And we read through Isaac, Abraham's son. I highlighted these in different colors because really most people divide Genesis into two sections, 1 through 11, which is kind of the story of man. And then beginning in chapter 12, the Bible starts the story of a special family. when you get to the end of Genesis, you've stopped talking about the special family specifically as Abraham's family, all the way through Jacob and Joseph to the calling of Moses. And that's the dispensation of law, because Moses was the one God used to give the law. So just keeping it all in perspective. So we begin with creation in Genesis 1 and 2. In the beginning, God. Elohim is the plural form of God. That's the word that was used. In the beginning, God. The Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit were all there. They were all part of creation. Jesus, the Word, he was there in the beginning. John 1-3 tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with him. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Jesus, the Creator. We live in a made from scratch, handmade world. Hebrews 11:3 tells us, by faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command. And what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. I like to tell the story. A picture's worth 1,000 words, and a picture put to music is worth 10,000 words.
What came before earth? What came before man? Well, here's a great tale of God's mighty glory. This is creation story. On the first day, God created light. He called this day and called darkness night. Oh, this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the first day. On the second day, God created the sky. The waters from heaven he did divide. Oh, this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the second day. On the third day, God created land with trees. They all bore fruits while the plants bore seeds. Oh, this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the third day. On the fourth day, God created the sun and the moon with stars when darkness would come. Oh, this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the fourth day. On the fifth day, God created fish in the seas
and birds to fly high above the trees.
Oh, this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the fifth day. On the sixth day, God had the most to do. He created man and the animals too. All this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the sixth day. On the seventh day, God chose to rest. He made this day holy and the earth he blessed. Oh, this was done with no delay, and that's what happened on the seventh day. So if you ever wondered where it all began, what came before earth, what came before man, this is the tale of God's mighty glory. This is the creation story. This is the creation story. This is creation story.
And evening passed, and morning came. The Jews celebrate a day from evening to evening. In Lexington, Kentucky, where the Ark has been recreated, Ken Ham presents programs. A lot of them are for kids that talk about creation and all the proof for creation being done a day at a time. Evolution is not the theory held by Ken Ham.
A dog and a cat is a cat, a horse is a horse, and a bat is a bat. Never one that turned into a rat. Not
the end of the sixth day of creation, God made humans. He created us in his image. Genesis 1:27 says, in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. That's a phrase for today's listening ears. He gave them dominion over all animal life. Genesis 1:28 says, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish of the sea, the birds in the air, and all the animals that scurry along the ground. Then he instituted marriage. Genesis 2:24. This explains why a man leaves his father and his mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Genesis 3 tells us about the fall of man, and it sets again a pattern that we see over and over again, sin's deceptive pattern. The serpent said to the lady, did God really say? He cast doubt on God's word. Then he said to her, you will be like God. He appealed to her pride. Doubt and pride lead to fall. Pride cometh before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. More effects of sin. Adam and Eve felt shame, and they hid from God because they thought they were naked. They had been naked all along. They weren't hiding from God before they sinned. So nakedness wasn't their sin. The guilt was what kills. The guilt was what was separating them from walking and talking with the Lord. Jesus was there. He walked in that garden. He talked to them. But guilt separated them from that. Guilt is so destructive. Guilt is a very destructive part of man's religion. There's a relationship with God, and then there's religion. Guilt is a result of bad religion. Effects of sin. The earth was cursed. The earth began to decay. It had been perfect. There were no animals that caused harm. There were no poisonous snakes. One animal was not afraid of the other. There were no weeds to cut off the growth of plants that were nutritious and beneficial to mankind. The earth began to decay. I had never thought until my Uncle Guy was talking about his chart, when he said there's two redemptive features. One is the redemption of mankind, a theme of the Bible. But there's another one, the redemption of the planet. The planet was perfect. It will be again in that new heaven and new earth that we see at the very end of Revelation. Then the serpent was cursed. That fight between Jesus and Satan was secure. They aren't opposites. They aren't of equal power. Satan will never win. But Genesis tells us he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. The first act of religion occurred. And that was the fact that when Adam and Eve were trying to create their own clothing, so that their shame would be covered. God killed an animal and covered them with the skins of an animal. That's the first act of redemption, because it's the beginning of the story of God's plan of redemption. His own son was slain to cover our sin. We'll move on to chapter 4, Cain and Abel. And this one usually raises, especially when you're teaching kids, the why questions. Cain was a farmer, and Abel was a shepherd, and God asked him for sacrifices, and Cain brought his vegetables or fruit, and Abel brought a lamb, and Abel's was accepted and Cain's wasn't. That's the story. But the truth was that God had a plan, and his plan was that there would be a sacrifice that covered sin, and that demanded a blood offering. In Hebrews, we're told, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin. How in the world did Cain and Abel know that? That's always the question. But it must have been demonstrated. It was demonstrated when God clothed Adam and Eve. But was it explained properly to Cain? That's what kids always want to know. And by the way, my mother told me a way to remember who killed who, because people always forget. And my mama told me, just remember, Lynn, Cain killed Abel with a leg off the table. Abel offered the fruit of his own labor, and Cain offered obedience. And I think that's another pattern that still occurs for me, especially. I have a continued practice of trying to tell God what I'm going to do for him versus just trying to follow the pattern and obey what he expects me to do.
That's Lynn.
That's Lynn. Okay, moving on. So chapter 5 is a pretty fascinating chapter. If you are reading stuff done by Chuck Missler, I put his introduction to the study of the whole Bible just because I wanted you to know this man. He's fascinating. And what he pulls out stuff in the Bible that nobody else ever thinks of. He's incredibly intelligent. But what he did for chapter 5 is he went and looked at the meanings of the names in the genealogy. So the genealogy seems like it's pretty boring, right? Adam begat Seth, blah, 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 blah. And this man looked at the meaning of these names. And the Bible doesn't define names. In fact, even if you look in the Bible encyclopedias, it won't give you the meaning of a name, a proper name. But if there are ways you can search for that meaning, so he did this. He says Adam, the meaning, and we know this, the meaning of Adam is man, right? The meaning of Seth is appointed. And when he was born, if you read that scripture, Eve says, a man was appointed unto me, or something to that effect. Enoch's name means mortal. Kenan's means sorrow. Mahalalel, however you say him, that name means the blessed God. Jared, which is the next one, shall come down. Enoch means teaching. And I want to talk about Enoch, but he was a teacher. Methuselah means his death shall bring. And Lamech, the despairing, and Noah, comfort or rest. Put those together like they're a sentence. Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching. His death shall bring the despairing comfort and rest. Now, doesn't that make that genealogy a little more interesting? Fascinating, I think. Enoch, one of my favorite people in the whole Bible. He was the first preacher. We didn't get that out of the reading. He was a prophet. We didn't get that out of the reading. But in the genealogy, it tells us that after 65, at the birth of his son Methuselah, it says he lived in close fellowship with God. So the guy was a godly man. He named that son Methuselah, which means his death shall bring. Leave that hanging a minute. He prophesied the second coming of the Lord. If you go back to Jude's the second to last book in the Bible. It only has one chapter, but verses 14 and 15 of the book of Jude tell you that Enoch's talked about the second coming of the Lord. Read it. It's fascinating. Genealogy tells us one day he disappeared because God took him. In the King James, it says Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. I talk a lot about the rapture of the church, the disappearance of the church, when the bride of Christ is called home. Well, Enoch was the first person to be raptured. He walked with God and was not, for God took him. He didn't die. In the book of Revelation, there's a picture of two people that return to earth and start preaching in Jerusalem itself. And I kind of think those two people are Enoch and Elijah. Remember, Elijah disappeared in a chariot of fire. Those are raptures. Those are disappearances of people on earth. Enoch was the first. Now go back to his son, whose name meant his death shall bring. He died the year of the flood. His death allowed that destruction. And he was the oldest man that ever lived, 969 years. So the oldest man that ever lived was the dividing point between the flood and the destruction of the people on earth. And then the riddle I always use with kids, and I love it. Who was the oldest man that ever lived, yet died before his father? All right, going on. From chapters 6 through 9, we have the flood of Noah. By the way, that's the ark there in the picture. You see this?
Right. Oh,
This is Naoma. This is my cousin and my friend Tony. That's the ark in
wow.
Lexington, and they built it to scale. They took the measurements and built that ark to scale. It's worth a visit.
Whoa.
And if you get that far, it's only one day to my house.
Oh,
So visit the ark and then come on in.
and is it actually physically possible to put that many different species on that particular, and what does it look like inside?
I'll share some pictures. I have pictures of what it
Okay.
looks like. Some, and yes, because remember I played that song that the kind is a
Kind
kind.
of a kind. Yeah. Uh-huh.
There are many species. Let's take the dinosaur, for example, which would be the big question. How did they get the dinosaur in there? Well, there are lots of different sizes of dinosaurs.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I do believe in evolution of species. What, all dogs came from a wolf?
Yeah.
So, and Ken Ham will tell you exactly how many species exist. Well, actually, here it is. There's 18,000. It takes 1,400 railroad cars to house them. And they didn't necessarily bring full-grown ones in there either. They've worked it out. You know, I love to use the term, I don't understand all I know about that.
Yeah.
So here's a bunch of stats about the flood, the process, how it, Noah entered the ark, and 7 days later the rain began, and 40 days it stopped, 110 days later it receded. You can look it back. This
and I thought, what is the significance of the 40 days?
There is an idea about the 40 days, but I can't report it. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, was he not?
Yeah, it seems like there's these recurring numbers.
Yeah, recurring numbers. So maybe a test. Okay. So I find it interesting that three groups of people are represented in that flood issue. There were those people that perished in the flood, those that were preserved through the flood, and those that were removed from the flood. Well, the only one removed was Enoch. But what I see, this analogy is what I believe for the tribulation period, the 7-year tribulation. I think that the church is represented by those removed. I think that the non-Christians are those that perish, and those that preserved, the Jewish people will be preserved through that tribulation. Chapter 10 is interesting and important.
You didn't do this, did you? Somebody else you found this?
You know who did this chart? Josephus. Do you know who Josephus is? He's the Jewish historian that gives us a lot of data. He was born in 37 or 38 AD and died in 100 AD. So he was contemporary in the times of the New Testament. But he is one of the prime historians that kind of confirms the accounts of the Bible. And he did this. And it's Noah's sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and then their families. And why it's important is that when you get into some of the prophets, Ezekiel, and you see these names reoccur as nations. And you kind of can pinpoint then who those nations are. Right now, Gomer, Magog, those make me immediately think of Russia. Cush makes me think of Africa. Those names are important in the study, and we'll probably get back to them when we get into the prophets.
Okay.
Next chapter was the story of Babel. Everybody knows it. Nimrod. He was a dictator. He founded Nineveh and Babylon, built that tower, and God interrupted the process because man again it's the same reoccurring tale. Man is trying to do his own thing instead of obeying God. So that's that story. And do you have
and it's about power too. I mean,
absolutely.
When I was reading that, it was like, how corrupt power can become.
Yep. So this is really as far as I need to go, because 1 through 11, I mean, I know we start a completely new era when we go into chapter 12 of Genesis.